In the evolution section, we discussed how certain traits in a population will become more common or less common depending on whether or not they confer a reproductive advantage. That's the basic fundamental idea behind natural selection. But not all traits are visible. We mostly were talking about things like peacock feathers, right? Like big showy feathers, or like camouflage. You blend in, and that helps you to reproduce a little bit better because you survive longer and you get more opportunities. But behavioral traits also have genetic components, and any trait with a genetic component that can be passed on to future generations is subject to evolutionary forces. So now we're going to take a step out of the basic evolution by natural selection material, and we're going to talk about evolutionary psychology, how certain types of behaviors have developed and evolved over time. Here in this photo, I have Koko the gorilla, and Koko was a very famous gorilla. Koko was one of these apes that we taught sign language to. She could learn a lot of words in sign language, and she could have a rudimentary conversation with her handlers. And it taught us all kinds of interesting things about how gorillas understand the world and how they think and how they process information and all that kind of cool stuff.
She can be very stubborn. Very willful.
Finished. You are not finished. You are not. You are not finished. You didn't do the work I asked.
Here you can see Koko getting her kitten. Koko was given a pet kitten at one point, and she loved that kitten. She would play with it. She would pet it all the time. One day, Koko got upset in her enclosure. And she decided to go on a little bit of a rampage. The kitten is fine, by the way. It's not where the story is going. And she decided to take the sink that was in her enclosure, and she tore it out of the wall, and she threw it and smashed it, right? She's a big gorilla. She can do these kind of things, much stronger than you or I could ever possibly be, no matter how much time we spend at the gym. The handlers then came in, and since Koko could speak sign language, they said, Koko, hey, what happened to the sink there? What happened? And Koko did not want to get in trouble, so Koko said that the kitten had picked up the sink and thrown it against the wall and smashed it.
She's got a good sense of humor.
Oh no! A monster! A monster coming to get the alligator!
The gorilla lied to us, and that is fascinating. She constructed a fiction, right? Think about how amazing that is. She came up with a statement about the world which was not true. She wrote material. She wrote fiction in this case. And not only that, not only was she able to come up with a series of events that did not happen, she thought they were plausible. Obviously, we know that the cat couldn't have thrown the sink. But in order to think that that strategy was going to work, Koko also needed something else. She needed a theory of mind. She needed to understand that there was information that she knew that the handlers that she was talking to did not know. She needed to understand that lying was even something that someone could do.
No, not fake. No.
So now we've realized that animals have a lot going on upstairs. They lead these kind of rich inner lives. Animals do think. They do perceive the world. They can learn things, and they can even create ideas inside of their head. And there's lots more examples of this, and I'll show you some more examples here. Really cool experiments done with birds, crows, and parrots, and things like that. All of them teaching us how clever animals are. Even the simplest animals have a lot more going on upstairs than we usually give them credit for. Now, to tell you the truth, when I tell you that story, I'm guilty of a pretty big cardinal sin in ethology, or animal behavior, or evolutionary psychology, and that is that I'm anthropomorphizing. I'm storytelling. I'm giving weight and human characteristics to what's going on inside this gorilla's head. And that is generally frowned upon, and has been since the late 1800s, when C. Lloyd Morgan wrote Morgan's Canon, which reads as follows: "In no case may we interpret an action as the outcome of the exercise of a higher psychical faculty if, it can be interpreted as the outcome of the exercise of one which stands lower in the psychological scale, which I think clarifies everything pretty neatly. What Morgan is saying is that if you observe some behavior, rather than assigning human characteristics or complex stories about what was going on inside the animal's head, it is better to talk about stimulus and response and imagine everything in a very strictly mechanical way. Maybe you are or are not right about what's going on in that animal's head, but if you stick to these kind of cause-effect observation, stimulus-response relationships, then you at least are being clinical and objective in your observations. You are not coloring the interpretation before you've even collected the data. So this is the idea of evolutionary psychology. Now again, behavior is a partially genetically controlled trait. You can have genes which make you a little bit predisposed to learning things a little bit easier, picking up information. You can have genetic traits that make you a little bit more prone to things like aggression, for instance, or maybe make you a little bit more skittish, a little bit more nervous. Personality and behavior does have some genetic components. There's a lot of environment involved as well, but it does have some genetic components. And anything with a genetic component is subject to evolutionary forces. Now, if we want to talk about behavior, the simplest kind of behavior we can talk about, or maybe the most just straightforward behavior we can talk about, is plant behavior. And that is a weird thing to say, right? Plants don't behave. Plants don't have personalities. But if any of you are gardeners or you keep houseplants around, you know that absolutely plants have personalities. And they do behave a little bit. Plants change how they grow in response to certain stimuli. And changing how they grow is kind of analogous to behavior in animals. So when I say plants behave, I mean they change how they grow in response to certain things in their environment. So for example, plants, if you leave them in a window and there's sun coming in the window, they will grow in such a way that they will tilt their leaves, their photosynthetic components, they'll tilt everything towards that source of light. And the reason why they're doing that is that it increases the surface area that's capturing the light, right? If you have your leaves held like this, my light source is back here, if you have them held like this, you're getting a little bit of light on there, but if you tilt it towards that source of light, you're going to get a lot more exposure. You can get more energy. Plants are autotrophs, right? This is how they feed, how they get energy from their environment is through sunlight. So any kind of growth behavior that will cause them to get more sunlight is probably going to be an advantage. And if it's an advantage, it'll be evolutionarily selected for you. See how this kind of thing works? Now, that's going to be completely genetically controlled, whether or not they grow in response to light. Now, plants don't have the ability to see where the light source is, but they have chemical processes, chemical signals inside their cells, which allow them to respond in kind of complex ways. A really good example of this is a hormone called Auxin. So all plant behavior is kind of moderated by hormones, and hormones are produced by your enzymes inside your cells, right? Certain enzymes are going to help you make your hormones, and those enzymes are proteins. Proteins are genetically controlled. So the production of these hormones ultimately is genetically controlled. Auxins are a group of related hormones which are responsible for a whole bunch of different effects in plants. We're going to narrow our conversation to just one example, and this is tropisms. Okay? A tropism is directional growth change in response to some stimuli. And the best example is phototropism. Here you can see a time lapse of a plant that's being grown with a light source over on the left. And you can see all the shoots are growing up. And then they change the direction of the light source. What do the plants do? Change their behavior. They switch back in the other direction. That's a tropism, growth in response to some stimuli. Phototropism, growth in response to light. Photo means light. How does this process work? Well, these auxins have an interesting effect, these hormones. Auxins concentrate themselves on the dark portion of a stem, on the darker portion. And when they concentrate on the darker portion, the effect that they have on cells is that it causes them to grow longer. It causes elongation of the cells on the dark side of the stem. So if you imagine, you have two sides, right? Two parallel sides of this plant, and one side starts getting longer. What does the other one got to do? It's going to buckle under there, right? Because it's connected. It's got to tilt over. So by aggregating these auxin hormones on the dark side of a stem, plants can cause themselves to tilt towards a source of light. This is an example of plant behavior. Now, why do I say this is evolutionarily controlled? Well, let's say we have two kinds of plant. One responds in this way and the other does not. One grows just fine, right? It grows up, but it just kind of spreads itself out and it doesn't care where the sun is. It won't get as much energy as one that has this growth response. So evolution will select for this plant behavioral response here. And then if we change the direction of the source of light, the auxins change the shape of the cells on the opposite side now. So it can bend one way and then bend another way, presuming, of course, that this is like an herbaceous plant. A tree is going to stand pretty much upright, but they have tropisms of their own that we could look at. There's other kinds of tropisms as well. There's something called Thigmotropism. This is a sensitive fern right here in the upper left-hand picture on the slide. And someone touches it, and it responds to that touch. It responds by folding itself up. Down below that, you have these tendrils coming from a pea plant vine. And what they do is if you've ever seen them in time-lapse, they send their tendrils out, and they kind of rotate around until they find something to touch, like lattice or a fence or another plant or something like that, and then those tendrils wrap around whatever they grab. Thigmotropism is a growth response because of touch stimuli. There's also gravitropism, and it works much the same as phototropism does. Auxins aggregate on one part of the root in order to make it grow towards the center of gravity. Why? Well, plants need to get water from their roots. So if the roots grow down, they're probably going to find more water. If there's plenty of water at the depth that the roots are at, instead of growing down, they'll start growing out because they don't want to keep going further down. They have water. They want to spread out as much as possible. But they need to know which way is down. So there's something called gravitropism. Gravitropism causes plant roots to turn downward. And you can't trick a plant either. If you start growing it one way and gravity is pushing the root down, the root will start growing down, and then you take it and you turn the entire flower pot on its side. If you take a look at this slide on the right-hand side here, it will suddenly divert down. You'll get a 90-degree turn in the growth of that root. So that's gravitropism. Tropisms, plant growth behaviors in response to stimuli.